In every American classroom, in every civics textbook, in every presidential inauguration, one document sits above all others: the Constitution of the United States. It is the most celebrated political document in American history, the foundation of the world's oldest democracy, the sacred text that transformed 13 struggling colonies into a global superpower. School children learn to revere it. Immigrants swear allegiance to it. Politicians wrap themselves in it. But there is a problem. The men who wrote the Constitution did not believe in democracy. They said so themselves. Openly, repeatedly, in their private correspondence, in their public writings, and in the secret debates of the Constitutional Convention, they made their feelings unmistakably clear. John Adams, the second president, wrote that democracy would inevitably lead to the destruction of property and liberty. He believed that ordinary citizens were too easily manipulated by demagogues, too prone to passion, too foolish to govern themselves. Alexander Hamilton called democracy a brilliant and beautiful idea that would inevitably dissolve into chaos. He spent his entire political career trying to concentrate power in the hands of the wealthy elite. Gouverneur Morris, who actually wrote the final draft of the Constitution, declared that the masses would never be content until they had seized all property from the rich. He saw the American people as a dangerous mob that needed to be contained. Edmund Randolph, who presented the Constitution to the nation, privately admitted that the document was designed specifically to check the turbulence and follies of democracy. James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, believed that the greatest threat to the new nation was not foreign invasion or economic collapse. It was what he called the tyranny of the majority. He feared that ordinary citizens would unite to redistribute wealth, cancel debts, and destroy the property of the rich. Madison's solution was not democracy. It was a republic, a system where power was filtered through representatives, where the masses were kept at a safe distance from government, where the wealthy would always control the levers of power. This is the great irony of American history. The document celebrated as the foundation of democracy was actually designed to prevent democracy. Now, this raises a question, one that historians have spent generations trying to avoid. If the founders hated democracy, why did they create a democratic constitution? Why would men who called the mob dangerous and ignorant write a document that begins with the words, "We the people"? This is the central mystery of the Constitution. It is the question that school books never answer. It is the question that animated this documentary. The answer is uncomfortable. It reveals a story that Americans have spent 2 centuries trying to forget. The Constitution was never intended to be a democratic document. It was an economic document, a conservative document, a document designed to protect the wealthy, restrain the masses, and rescue a failing nation from financial collapse. This is the true origin of the U.S. Constitution, and it explains everything that followed. To understand why the Constitution was written, we have to first understand the chaos that made it necessary. In the years after the Revolutionary War, the United States was falling apart. The Articles of Confederation, America's first constitution, had created a national government so weak that it could barely function. Congress could not tax. It could not regulate trade. It could not raise an army. It could not even pay its own debts. By 1786, the national government was bankrupt. The economy had collapsed. States were fighting each other over trade. The country was spiraling into debt and chaos. And then, in western Massachusetts, a rebellion erupted that terrified the nation's ruling class. A former army captain named Daniel Shays led thousands of desperate farmers in an armed uprising against the state government. They were not fighting for independence, they were fighting for survival. Their farms were being seized by creditors. Their families were starving. They had fought for American liberty, and now they were losing everything. The rebellion was suppressed, but the wealthy elite looked at Shays Rebellion and saw a terrifying future. They saw the French Revolution before it happened. They saw the mob rising up. They saw property destroyed. They saw government overthrown. And they decided that something had to be done, something dramatic, something that would permanently prevent the masses from ever seizing control of the nation. That something was the Constitution. But the men who wrote it had to be careful. They could not admit that they were writing an anti-democratic document. They had to frame it in the language of liberty. They had to pretend they were protecting the people's rights, while actually limiting the people's power. This was the great deception at the heart of American history. And it begins with a secret meeting in Philadelphia. In May 1787, 55 men gathered in Independence Hall. They were not elected by the people. They were chosen by state legislatures, wealthy politicians, lawyers, merchants, and plantation owners. They represented less than 1% of the population. They had been sent to Philadelphia for a single purpose, to revise the Articles of Confederation. But within days, they decided to scrap the Articles entirely. They would write an entirely new constitution, and they would do it behind closed doors. The windows were boarded up, guards were posted at the doors. The delegates swore a solemn oath of secrecy. Anyone who leaked the proceedings to the public would be expelled. This secrecy was not accidental. It was essential to their plan. Because if the American people had known what was really happening in Philadelphia, the Constitution would never have been written. James Madison took careful notes on everything that was said in those secret sessions. But he did not publish those notes until after his death, 30 years later. Why would Madison hide the true history of the Constitution for 3 decades? Because he knew that the truth would destroy the myth. The Constitution was not a democratic revolution. It was a counter-revolution, an elite-driven response to economic collapse. A document designed to rescue the American experiment from the American people. This is the story that historians have buried. This is the true origin of the Constitution. To understand the Constitution, we must first understand the catastrophe that made it necessary. The year was 1783. The Revolutionary War was finally over. The Treaty of Paris had been signed. The British had officially recognized the independence of the United States. America had won, but victory came with a price, a crushing, overwhelming price. The new nation was drowning in debt. The Continental Congress had borrowed enormous sums from foreign nations and wealthy American citizens to finance the war. But under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no power to tax. It could only ask the states for money, and the states rarely paid. By 1783, the national government owed more than $40 million. It had no way to pay it back. Foreign creditors were demanding repayment. American soldiers and merchants were demanding their back pay, and Congress could do nothing. This was not a functioning government. It was a national embarrassment. Foreign diplomats openly mocked the United States. British officials refused to negotiate trade agreements. The Spanish closed the Mississippi River to American commerce, and the American government could not respond because it had no army, no navy, and no money to create either. But the collapse was not only happening at the national level. The states were fighting each other like rival nations. Imagine this. New York placed tariffs on imports from Connecticut. Connecticut responded by restricting trade with New York. Pennsylvania taxed goods from New Jersey. New Jersey threatened retaliation. These were not foreign enemies fighting America. These were American states fighting each other. They were behaving like medieval European kingdoms, not united partners in a new republic. And the American economy was suffocating. The war had disrupted agriculture and trade. Farmers were producing less. Merchants were selling less. The flow of goods had ground to a halt. At the same time, a massive economic recession had begun. Inflation was spiraling out of control. The continental dollar, the currency printed during the war, had become nearly worthless. Prices skyrocketed while wages collapsed. This was the economic environment in which ordinary Americans were trying to survive. And many were not surviving. Farmers who had fought for American independence, who had risked their lives against the British, were now losing their farms to creditors. They could not pay their debts, they could not feed their families, they could not find justice in courts controlled by the wealthy elite. The Continental Congress could do nothing. The state governments could do nothing. The entire American experiment was falling apart. And then, in 1786, the rebellion began. It started in western Massachusetts, among a population of farmers who had been pushed to the breaking point. They had fought in the Revolution. They had believed in the cause of liberty. They had expected that after the war, life would improve. Instead, they faced foreclosure, debtor's prison, and starvation. Their only hope was the Massachusetts state government, but that government was controlled by wealthy merchants and bankers in Boston, men who cared little about the suffering of Western farmers. The government raised taxes, demanded payment in hard currency that no one had, and refused to address the farmers' pleas. The farmers decided they had no choice. In August 1786, they began marching on local courthouses, preventing judges from presiding over foreclosure cases. They were not attacking the government, not yet. They were demanding justice. But the government responded with force. Militias were mobilized, arrest warrants were issued, the rebellion was declared illegal. And then one man turned the rebellion into a revolution. His name was Daniel Shays. He had been a captain in the Continental Army. He had fought at Bunker Hill and Saratoga. He had bled for American independence. And now he was leading thousands of desperate farmers in armed resistance against the government he had once fought to create. Shays Rebellion was not a random act of violence. It was a coordinated movement of armed men demanding relief from economic oppression. The farmers shut down courthouses across western Massachusetts. They freed prisoners from debtors' jails. They marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield to seize weapons and ammunition. And they succeeded, at least for a time. The Massachusetts government appealed to the Continental Congress for help, but Congress had no army. It could not send soldiers. It could not even afford to pay for supplies. The rebellion continued for months, and the American elite watched in horror. This was not just a local uprising, it was a warning, a glimpse of what could happen across the entire country. If the economy continued to collapse, if the government continued to fail, if the farmers continued to rebel, The revolution would tear itself apart. Shays Rebellion was eventually crushed by a privately funded militia raised by Boston merchants. But the lesson was not lost on the nation's ruling class. They had seen what happens when the government is too weak to protect private property. They had seen what happens when ordinary citizens believe they have no other choice. They had seen the mob rising up. And they knew that if nothing changed, America would devolve into chaos. The Articles of Confederation had failed. The national government was powerless. The states were fighting each other. The economy was collapsing. The people were revolting. The American experiment, the grand experiment in Republican government, was on the verge of complete failure. This was the crisis that led to the Constitution. But here is what historians often get wrong. The men who wrote the Constitution were not trying to save democracy. They were trying to save themselves. Many of the delegates who gathered in Philadelphia in 1787 were among the wealthiest men in America. They owned vast estates. They held government bonds. They had lent money to the government during the war. If the national government collapsed, they would lose everything. Their bonds would become worthless. Their loans would never be repaid. Their property would be vulnerable to mob confiscation. They had a powerful personal interest in creating a strong national government, and they were terrified of the people. This is the fear that animated the Constitutional Convention, the fear of democracy, the fear of the mob, the fear that the American Revolution had unleashed forces they could no longer control. Shays' Rebellion had shown them precisely what they were afraid of. In the words of one contemporary observer, the rebellion proved that the American people are incapable of self-government, that they would sink into anarchy without a strong hand to guide them. This was not an isolated opinion. It was the dominant belief among the men who wrote the Constitution. They looked at the chaos of the 1780s and concluded that the people could not be trusted. And so, in the summer of 1787, they gathered in Philadelphia to fix the problem. But they were not gathering to create a democracy. They were gathering to prevent one. In May 1787, 55 men arrived in Philadelphia. They were not elected by the American people. They were chosen by state legislatures, wealthy politicians, lawyers, merchants, bankers, and plantation owners. They were the American elite, the top 1% of the top 1%. And they had been sent to Philadelphia for one purpose: to revise the Articles of Confederation. That was the official mandate, the official instruction, the official reason for their gathering. But they had other plans. Before the convention even began, a small group of delegates held a secret meeting at the Indian Queen Tavern in Philadelphia. They had decided in advance what they were going to do. They were not going to revise the Articles of Confederation. They were going to destroy them. They were going to write an entirely new constitution, and they were going to do it in complete secrecy. The official proceedings began on May 24, 1787. The delegates gathered in the Pennsylvania State House, the same building where the Declaration of Independence had been signed 11 years earlier. But this was not a celebration. This was a conspiracy. The very first action the delegates took was to close the doors. All windows were boarded up. Guards were posted at every entrance. No one could enter. No one could leave. Anyone who leaked the proceedings to the public would be immediately expelled. The delegates swore a solemn oath of secrecy. They agreed that every word spoken during the convention would remain confidential for as long as the convention lasted. And for the next 4 months, they kept that promise. The American people had no idea what was happening inside that room. Newspapers printed speculation. Critics demanded transparency. But the delegates refused. They knew that if the public discovered what they were really doing, the entire enterprise would collapse. James Madison, the primary architect of the Constitution, took detailed notes on everything that was said. But he did not publish those notes during his lifetime. He waited 30 years. He died in 1836, and only then were his notes finally released. Why did Madison hide the true history of the Constitution for 3 decades? Because the truth was politically dangerous. Because the truth contradicted everything the American people believed about their revolution. Because the truth would destroy the myth. And the truth is this: the Constitutional Convention was extra-legal. It was unauthorized. It was a direct violation of the law. The delegates had no authority to scrap the Articles of Confederation. Their official instructions were to propose amendments, nothing more. But they ignored those instructions. They had come to Philadelphia to create a new government, not to fix the old one. They had come to centralize power, not to decentralize it. They had come to restrain democracy, not to expand it. And they did it all behind closed doors. The convention lasted from May to September 1787. For 100 sweltering summer days, the delegates debated. They argued. They fought. They threatened to walk out. They returned to the table. They rewrote their draft. And all of it was hidden from the public. The official journal of the convention was later published, but it was deliberately vague. It recorded votes and procedures, not the actual debates. If historians wanted to know what was really said in Philadelphia, they had to rely on Madison's private notes. And those notes reveal a very different picture than the one taught in schools. Inside the convention, the delegates openly discussed their contempt for democracy. Alexander Hamilton stood up in front of the entire assembly and declared that the government of Great Britain was the best in the world. He proposed a constitution that would create a president for life, a king in all but name. Hamilton was not alone. Many delegates believed that the government should be controlled by the wealthy elite. They argued that only men of property could be trusted to govern wisely. They believed that the masses were too ignorant, too unstable, and too dangerous to participate in government. Edmund Randolph presented the Virginia Plan, the first draft of the Constitution, which proposed a government with no limits on its power. The plan gave Congress the authority to override state laws, to tax the people directly, and to maintain a standing army. This was not a government of the people. This was a government over the people. But the delegates also knew they had a problem. They could not simply create a monarchy. The American people had just fought a war against a king. If the delegates proposed a new king, the people would reject it. They might even rise up again. Another Shays Rebellion, another wave of violence. So the delegates had to disguise their work. They had to frame the Constitution in the language of liberty, while making sure that liberty was carefully controlled. The result was a document full of contradictions, a document that claimed to represent we the people, while limiting who those people actually were. A document that promised freedom while protecting slavery. A document that celebrated democracy while preventing it from spreading too far. And all of this was written in secret. The convention nearly collapsed several times. Delegates walked out in protest. States threatened to leave. The issue of slavery almost destroyed everything. But they persisted. They compromised. They wrote and rewrote again until they had a document they could present to the nation. On September 17th, 1787, The final draft was signed. 39 of the delegates put their names on the Constitution, but 3 refused. Elbridge Gerry, George Mason, and Edmund Randolph, all of whom had participated in the convention, refused to sign the final document. They believed it was too powerful, too centralized, too dangerous to the rights of ordinary citizens. Mason declared that the Constitution would inevitably lead to a monarchy or a corrupt, oppressive aristocracy. He warned that the document would end in a monarchy, not because the delegates wanted a king, but because the government they had created was too strong to be controlled by the people. Gerry went further. He called the Constitution the most dangerous plan that ever was proposed to the people of America. And yet, despite these warnings, the Constitution was sent to the states for ratification. But the delegates had one more trick. They refused to allow amendments. They refused to allow changes. They told the states, "Ratify this document exactly as we have written it, or we will have nothing." This was not a negotiation. This was an ultimatum, and the American people had no idea what had actually happened inside that room. They did not know about the debates. They did not know about the compromises. They did not know about the contempt for democracy that had driven the entire enterprise. They were told that the Constitution was a gift from wise men. They were told that it protected their liberty. They were told that it was the greatest political document ever written. But they were not told the truth. The truth is that the Constitution was written in secret by men who had no legal authority to write it, men who despised democracy, men who feared the people, men who designed a government that would protect their property and limit the power of the masses. And then they pretended it was the opposite. This was the great deception at the heart of American history. And it worked. The Constitution was ratified. The new government was established. The American people celebrated their triumph. But the truth remained hidden behind locked doors and sealed archives. It remained hidden for 30 years. It remained hidden until James Madison's death in 1836. And even then, historians looked away. They did not want to admit that the Constitution had been born in secrecy and deception. They did not want to admit that the founders had feared democracy. They did not want to admit that the sacred document was never intended to be democratic at all. So, they rewrote the story. They created a mythology. They turned the founders into philosophers and the Constitution into a religious text. And the truth was buried. The true origin of the U.S. Constitution, written in secret by men who hated democracy, was replaced with a comfortable lie. A lie that Americans have been telling themselves for more than 200 years. But now, with Madison's notes, with the delegates' private letters, with the records of the convention, the truth is finally available. And it changes everything. Now we arrive at the heart of the mystery. If the Constitution was not a democratic document, if it was written in secret by men who despise democracy, if it was designed to restrain the masses rather than empower them, then what was it actually created to do? The answer is simpler than most historians are willing to admit. The Constitution was created to protect money, specifically the money of the wealthy elite who wrote it. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is documented history, and it has been documented for nearly a century, ever since the American historian Charles Beard published his groundbreaking work, An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, in 1913. Beard did something that no historian had done before. He looked at the financial records of the delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention, and he discovered something remarkable. Nearly all of them had a direct personal financial interest in creating a strong central government. Beard examined the property holdings, investments, debts, and economic connections of every delegate. He found that the vast majority were wealthy men who stood to gain enormous personal profits from the Constitution's provisions. They were not disinterested philosophers. They were investors, speculators, bankers, merchants, plantation owners, men who had lent money to the government during the Revolutionary War and who feared that the weak Articles government would never repay them, and they designed a government that would guarantee repayment. Let's look at the evidence. Of the 55 delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention, more than 40 owned significant amounts of government securities, bonds and notes issued by the Continental Congress during the war. These securities had become nearly worthless under the Articles of Confederation. The government had no power to tax, no power to raise revenue, no power to pay its debts. But under the new Constitution, the government would have the power to tax. It would have the power to raise revenue. It would have the power to pay its debts. And that meant that the delegates' securities would suddenly become valuable again. This was not an accident. This was the explicit purpose of the Constitution's financial provisions. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to lay and collect taxes. It gives Congress the power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. It gives Congress the power to pay the debts of the nation. The delegates wrote those provisions knowing exactly who would benefit. They would benefit. Hamilton, who later became Secretary of the Treasury, proposed a plan that would exchange the old, worthless securities for new bonds at full face value. This was called funding the debt, and it made the holders of those securities very, very wealthy. But there was an even deeper financial connection. Many of the delegates were land speculators. They owned vast tracts of western land that had been acquired through speculative investments. But those land claims were disputed. Some states claimed the same territory. The British and Spanish claimed parts of it as well. Under the weak Articles government, there was no authority to settle those disputes. But under the new Constitution, the federal government would have the power to enforce land claims and to protect the speculators' investments. Madison himself owned thousands of acres of western land. His personal fortune was tied directly to the success of the new government. Another delegate, Robert Morris, was the wealthiest man in America. He had financed the Revolutionary War with his own money. He had lent millions to the government, and he was desperate to be repaid. Morris was also a notorious speculator. He had bought up huge amounts of government securities at pennies on the dollar. If the Constitution passed and the debt was funded, Morris would become even richer than he already was. And he was not alone. A majority of the delegates had similar financial interests. They were not philosophers seeking the public good. They were investors seeking private profit. This is the uncomfortable truth that Beard uncovered, and it has never been adequately addressed in American classrooms. But Beard was not the only historian to reach this conclusion. Other historians have examined the economic backgrounds of the delegates and confirmed his findings. The historian Forrest MacDonald studied the economic interests of the delegates in detail. He found that the Constitution was supported overwhelmingly by men who held government securities, owned Western lands, or had other financial interests that depended on a strong central government. The men who opposed the Constitution, the anti-federalists, were typically small farmers, debtors, and ordinary citizens who feared that a powerful government would be used to enrich the wealthy at their expense. And they were right. The Constitution created a government that was explicitly designed to protect the property of the wealthy. It contained no protections for the poor, no protections for debtors, no protections for the workers and farmers who had fought the revolution. Instead, it created a system that made it easier for the elite to accumulate wealth and harder for the masses to challenge them. Consider the Constitution's provisions on debt. Article 1, Section 10, prohibits states from emitting bills of credit, that is, printing paper money. It prohibits states from making anything but gold and silver legal tender. It prohibits states from passing impairing the obligation of contracts. On the surface, these provisions seem technical, but their effect was devastating for ordinary Americans. Under the Articles of Confederation, states had the power to print paper money. This allowed debtors, primarily small farmers, to pay their debts with depreciated currency. It was a form of relief for people who were struggling to survive. The Constitution took that power away. It required that all debts be paid in hard currency, gold and silver, which debtors rarely had. And it prohibited states from passing laws that would help debtors. No more debt relief, no more bankruptcy protection, no more government assistance for people who had fallen behind. The Constitution was designed to make sure creditors were paid, even if it meant debtors lost everything. Now consider the Constitution's provisions on slavery. The delegates protected slavery in multiple ways. They allowed the slave trade to continue for 20 more years. They required that fugitive slaves be returned to their owners. They counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation, giving Southern slaveholders enormous political power. These provisions were not accidents. They were deliberate compromises designed to protect the economic interests of the Southern plantation owners who attended the convention. The delegates knew that slavery was economically essential to the Southern states. They knew that any constitution that threatened slavery would never be ratified, so they protected it. This is the economic motive in action. The delegates were not trying to create a just society. They were trying to protect their wealth. They were trying to preserve their power. They were trying to ensure that the American Revolution did not lead to economic equality. Now, consider what they did not do. The Constitution does not mention the right to vote. It does not guarantee the right to a fair trial in any detail. It does not protect the rights of workers. It does not protect the rights of the poor. It does not guarantee economic justice. Instead, it creates a government that is deliberately designed to be resistant to popular will. The president is not elected directly by the people. He is elected by the Electoral College, a body that the founders created specifically to prevent ordinary voters from choosing the chief executive. Senators were originally chosen by state legislatures, not by the people. They did not become directly elected until the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913, more than a century after the Constitution was written. The Supreme Court is appointed, not elected. It serves for life, with no accountability to the people. Even the House of Representatives, the only directly elected branch, is deliberately limited in its power. It cannot pass legislation without the approval of the Senate and the President. It cannot control the budget without the approval of the executive branch. The founders designed this system to slow down democracy. to make it harder for the people to change the government, to protect the wealthy elite from the consequences of their own economic policies. This was not a failure of the Constitution. This was the Constitution's explicit purpose. And the delegates knew it. James Madison wrote in Federalist No. 10 that the primary function of government is to protect the various and unequal distribution of property. He argued that the most important task of government is to protect the wealthy from the poor. He called the conflict between rich and poor the most common and durable source of factions. He feared that the poor would unite to redistribute wealth and seize the property of the rich, and he designed the Constitution to prevent that from happening. The Constitution was not a democratic document. It was an anti-democratic document. It was designed to create a government that would serve the wealthy, protect the wealthy, and defend the wealthy against the masses. And it has succeeded remarkably well. For more than 2 centuries, the Constitution has protected the economic interests of the American elite. It has made it difficult for the poor to challenge the rich. It has made it difficult for ordinary citizens to change the system. This is not a secret. This is documented history, and it is the true origin of the U.S. Constitution. On September 17, 1787, the Constitutional Convention finally ended. After 4 months of secret debates, the delegates had produced a document, the Constitution of the United States. 39 men signed it. 3 refused. And then the real battle began. The Constitution was not automatically law. It had to be ratified, approved, by the states. And ratification was not guaranteed. In fact, it was far from certain. The delegates knew this. They knew that many Americans would oppose the Constitution. They knew that the document was controversial. They knew that the American people might reject it entirely. So they designed a ratification process that would give them every possible advantage. Article 7 of the Constitution required ratification by only 9 of the 13 states. Not all 13, just 9. This was a deliberate choice. The delegates knew that achieving unanimous approval was impossible, so they lowered the threshold. They also decided that ratification would not be done by state legislatures. It would be done by special state conventions, conventions that could be controlled more easily by the wealthy elite. This was not democracy. This was political manipulation. And the manipulation continued throughout the ratification process. The Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, controlled the narrative. They flooded the newspapers with essays and pamphlets defending the document. They wrote under pseudonyms like Publius, the famous Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. These essays were brilliant. They were persuasive. They made the Constitution sound like the greatest political document ever written. But they were also carefully crafted to obscure the Constitution's true purpose. They emphasized the benefits of the new government. They downplayed its anti-democratic features. They never mentioned the economic motives behind its creation. The anti-federalists, the opponents of the Constitution, tried to warn the public. They wrote essays of their own. They raised objections. They pointed out the Constitution's flaws. But they could not compete with the Federalist propaganda machine. The Federalists had more money, more connections, more control over the press. And they used every tool at their disposal. Let's examine the ratification process, state by state, because the story it tells is not one of democratic consensus. It is one of narrow victories, political maneuvering, and elite pressure. First, Delaware. Delaware ratified the Constitution on December 7, 1787. The vote was unanimous, 30-0. But Delaware was a small state with strong ties to the wealthy merchants who supported the Constitution. It was never in doubt. Pennsylvania ratified next, on December 12, 1787. But the process was anything but democratic. The Federalists rushed the ratification convention through the legislature, literally dragging anti-Federalist legislators into the chamber to achieve a quorum. The vote was 46-23, a comfortable majority, but one achieved through procedural manipulation. New Jersey ratified on December 18, 1787. Like Delaware, it was a small state with strong economic ties to the Federalist cause. The vote was unanimous. Georgia ratified on January 2, 1788. Also unanimous. But Georgia was a frontier state dependent on federal protection from Native American tribes and foreign powers. It needed the Constitution to survive. Connecticut ratified on January 9, 1788, by a vote of 128-40, a solid majority. But Connecticut was a commercial state with a thriving merchant class that supported the Federalist agenda. By January 1788, 5 states had ratified the Constitution, but the real battles were still ahead. Massachusetts was the first major test. The state was divided between Federalists in the east and anti-Federalists in the west, the same farmers who had supported Shays Rebellion. The anti-Federalists were powerful. They had the numbers, but the Federalists had the strategy. They promised to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution after ratification, a concession that weakened the anti-Federalist opposition. On February 6, 1788, Massachusetts ratified the Constitution by a narrow vote of 187 to 168, a margin of only 19 votes. If just 10 delegates had changed their votes, the Constitution would have been defeated. This was not a landslide, this was a razor-thin victory. Maryland ratified on April 28, 1788, by a vote of 63 to 11, another solid majority. But Maryland was a state where the Federalists controlled the political machinery. The anti-Federalists had little power. South Carolina ratified on May 23, 1788, by a vote of 149 to 73. But South Carolina was a slave state. Its delegates supported the Constitution because it protected slavery. Without that protection, ratification would have failed. Then came Virginia, the largest and most powerful state in the nation. The Virginia Convention was one of the most dramatic political battles in American history. The Anti-Federalists were led by Patrick Henry, the legendary orator who had declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Henry was brilliant. He was passionate. He was determined to defeat the Constitution. He called the document the most fatal plan that could possibly be conceived. He warned that it would abolish the state governments and create a consolidated monarchy. He argued that the Constitution would destroy American liberty, and he nearly succeeded. The Virginia Convention was deeply divided. The Anti-Federalists had strong support. The Federalists were led by James Madison, who faced a formidable opponent in Henry. The debate lasted for weeks. Both sides argued fiercely. The outcome was uncertain until the very end. On June 24, 1788, Virginia ratified the Constitution, but only by a vote of 89 to 79, a margin of just 10 votes out of 168. If Patrick Henry had convinced just 6 more delegates, the Constitution would have been defeated in Virginia, and if Virginia had rejected the Constitution, the new nation would likely have collapsed. Then came New York. New York was another battleground. The Anti-Federalists were led by Governor George Clinton. They were powerful, they had the numbers. But the Federalists had Alexander Hamilton, one of the most brilliant political minds in American history. Hamilton wrote and wrote and wrote. He penned essay after essay defending the Constitution. He mobilized the Federalist machine. He pressured, persuaded, and manipulated. And on July 26, 1788, New York ratified the Constitution by a vote of 30 to 27, a margin of just 3 votes. 3 votes. If 3 delegates had changed their minds, New York would have rejected the Constitution. And without New York, the commercial and financial center of the nation, the new government would have been crippled. Rhode Island refused to ratify at all. It held out until 1790, and even then, it ratified only after the Constitution was already law. But Rhode Island did not matter. The Federalists had already secured the necessary 9 states. North Carolina ratified in 1789. New York had already voted. The Constitution was law. But this was not a democratic triumph. This was a political victory achieved through manipulation, secrecy, and narrow margins. The Federalists had won, but barely. In the key states, ratification passed by margins so narrow that a handful of votes could have changed everything. And those narrow margins reveal something important about the Constitution. It was not popular. It was not universally supported. It was a deeply controversial document that nearly failed. The American people were divided. In many states, the Anti-Federalists had the support of the majority, but the Federalists controlled the levers of power. They controlled the press. They controlled the conventions. They controlled the process. The Constitution was ratified by a political elite acting against the will of many ordinary Americans. And then, the Federalists did something remarkable. They rewrote history. They created a mythology. They portrayed the Constitution's ratification as a triumph of democratic will. They turned the narrow, contested victory into an inevitable expression of the people's wisdom. They erased the Anti-Federalists from the story or reduced them to footnotes. They buried the protests, the warnings, the fears that had animated the opposition, and they created the myth of the Constitution as a sacred document, universally loved, democratically approved. This was the final act of the deception that had begun in Philadelphia. The Constitution had been written in secret. It had been ratified by narrow margins. It had been opposed by millions of Americans. But the Federalists did not want the public to know that. So they created a new history, a comfortable history, a history that made the Constitution seem inevitable, and the public believed it. For more than 2 centuries, Americans have been taught that the Constitution was a democratic triumph, but the evidence tells a different story. The ratification of the Constitution was not a triumph of the people. It was a triumph of the wealthy elite, achieved through political manipulation, secret maneuvering, and narrow margins. And it left the American people with a government they had never fully chosen. We have now traced the Constitution from its secret origins in Philadelphia through its narrow, contested ratification. We have seen the economic motives of the delegates. We have heard the warnings of the Anti-Federalists. We have witnessed the political manipulation that secured the document's approval. And now we arrive at the final question. If the Constitution was born in secrecy, driven by economic self-interest, and ratified through narrow margins, how did it become the sacred document we revere today? How did a controversial, anti-democratic document transform into the foundation of American democracy? The answer is that the transformation did not happen naturally. It was manufactured. It was created by historians, politicians, and educators who had a powerful interest in presenting the Constitution as a democratic masterpiece. Let's begin with the historians. In the decades after the Constitution's ratification, American historians began writing the story of the founding. They were not neutral observers. They were patriots. They were nationalists. They wanted to create a unified American identity, and the Constitution was central to that identity. So they rewrote the history of the Constitution's creation. They ignored the secret debates. They downplayed the economic motives. They erased the anti-federalist opposition. Instead, they created a narrative of heroic founders, enlightened philosophers, and democratic ideals. The most influential of these historians was George Bancroft. In the mid-19th century, Bancroft wrote a massive 10-volume history of the United States. It was the most widely read American history of its era, and Bancroft's history was a myth. He portrayed the Constitution as the culmination of American destiny. He described the founders as demigods, men of almost supernatural wisdom and virtue. He claimed that the Constitution was the most perfect form of government ever devised by man. Bancroft ignored the evidence. He knew about the secret debates. He knew about the economic motives, but he chose to present the Constitution as a democratic triumph because that was the story Americans wanted to hear. And Americans believed him. The myth of the Constitution continued to grow throughout the 19th century. The Civil War transformed the Constitution into a symbol of national unity. The Constitution became the sacred text of American civil religion. School textbooks presented the Constitution as the product of democratic ideals. Children learned to memorize the preamble. They learned to revere the founders. They learned that the Constitution was the foundation of American liberty. But the textbooks were not telling the truth. They were telling a sanitized version of history, a version that removed the uncomfortable details. The anti-federalists were forgotten. The narrow ratification margins were forgotten. The economic motives were forgotten. Instead, Americans were taught a simple story. The founders were wise men who created a democratic government. The Constitution protected liberty. The American experiment was the greatest success in human history. This was the mythology that became the foundation of American national identity. But here is the problem. The mythology is not history. History is the truth, however uncomfortable. And the truth is that the Constitution was not created by wise men seeking democratic ideals. It was created by wealthy men seeking economic advantage. The founders were not philosophers. They were politicians, investors, speculators, and plantation owners. They had personal financial interests in the Constitution's provisions. They were not trying to create a democracy. They were trying to protect their property. The ratification was not a democratic triumph. It was a political victory achieved through manipulation and narrow margins. Millions of Americans opposed the Constitution. In many states, the anti-federalists represented the majority. And the Bill of Rights, which Americans celebrate as the greatest protection of individual liberty, was not part of the original Constitution. It was added later, only after the Federalists promised it to secure ratification. The Bill of Rights was a concession. It was not a gift. It was a political compromise designed to win votes. This is not to say that the Constitution has no value. It has enormous historical significance. It created a framework for government that has lasted more than 2 centuries. It established principles that have guided American democracy for generations. But the Constitution is not sacred. It is not a divine document. It is a human document, flawed, compromised, and created by men with imperfect motives. And when we pretend otherwise, we do a disservice to history. We do a disservice to the millions of Americans who opposed the Constitution. We do a disservice to the anti-federalists who warned about the dangers of centralized power. We do a disservice to the enslaved people who were written out of the Constitution's protections. We do a disservice to the truth. The true origin of the U.S. Constitution is not a story of democratic idealism. It is a story of economic self-interest, political manipulation, and elite control. This is what historians got wrong. This is what they have been getting wrong for more than 2 centuries. But now, the truth is available. The evidence is clear. The records are open. And we can finally understand the Constitution for what it is, a document designed to protect the wealthy, restrain the masses, and preserve the power of the elite. This is the true origin of the U.S. Constitution. So let us return to the question we asked at the beginning of this documentary. If the founders despised democracy, why did they create a democratic constitution? The answer is now clear. They did not create a democratic constitution. They created an anti-democratic constitution and then pretended it was the opposite. They created a government designed to protect property, not liberty. They created a system designed to serve the wealthy, not the people. And then they built a mythology to hide what they had done. The Constitution is not the foundation of American democracy. It is the foundation of American inequality. This is not a cynical conclusion. It is an honest one. It is the conclusion that historians have been avoiding for more than 200 years. But now, we can finally tell the truth. The true origin of the U.S. Constitution is not what we were taught in school. It is not what we learned from the textbooks. It is not what we heard in the speeches. The true origin of the U.S. Constitution is a story of power, money, and deception. And it is time that story was told. The Constitution is not a sacred text. It is a human document. It is flawed. It is compromised. It was created by men who did not trust democracy and did not believe in equality. And until we understand that, we cannot truly understand America. We cannot truly understand the Constitution. This is the true origin of the U.S. Constitution. And now, you know the truth.